The day Anika Falcon stepped off the stage in Ash Hollow, Wade Mercer had exactly $11.40 to his name, a mill that hadn't turned a real profit in 3 years, and a contract he hadn't read closely enough sitting in a drawer that was quietly bleeding him dry. He thought his biggest problem was finding someone to share the burden. He had no idea he'd already found the person who would tear apart everything he thought he knew about his own business, and force him to choose between the safe way out and the only future worth fighting for. This is that story. If you're watching until the end, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The stagecoach from Billings arrived 40 minutes late, which wasn't unusual for October in the Montana Territory, when the road past Ridgeline Creek turned soft and the horses had to be walked through 200 yards of mud that looked solid until it wasn't. Wade Mercer had been standing outside Donnelly's dry goods store for the better part of an hour, hat in hand despite the cold, trying to look like a man who had his affairs in order. He did not have his affairs in order. His boots were clean, at least. He'd spent 20 minutes on them that morning with a rag and a tin of black paste he'd been saving for something, though he couldn't remember what. He was 41 years old, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered past handsome into something more like permanent. His hands were the hands of a man who worked, thick-knuckled, scarred across 3 fingers of the left from a belt incident 2 winters back, and he had not thought to hide them until the moment the stagecoach rounded the corner by the livery, and he suddenly became very aware of how they looked. Emmett Chow, who ran the feed store and had an opinion about everything within a 5-mile radius of Ash Hollow, was leaning against the post outside his establishment with his arms crossed. "She's probably 40 and hard-tempered," Emmett said, not unkindly. "That's who answers those advertisements, Wade. Women with no other options and plenty of opinions." "Then we'll have something in common," Wade said. Emmett made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The coach came to a stop in the center of the road, raising a fine spray of mud along its lower panels. Frank Obie, who drove the Billings run 3 days a week and talked enough for 6 men doing it, climbed down from the box and pulled open the door with the ceremony of someone who'd been waiting all morning for an audience. 2 passengers stepped out. The first was a cattle buyer named Hendricks, who came through every few weeks and always smelled strongly of pipe tobacco. The second was a woman. She was younger than Emmett's prediction. Wade put her somewhere around 33, maybe 34, though there was something in the set of her eyes that made guessing feel imprecise. Medium height, dark coat, travel-stained at the hem. Brown hair pulled back severely, though several strands had come loose along the journey, and she hadn't bothered to fix them. She carried a single trunk, which Frank set down in the mud with a thud, and a leather satchel that she kept on her shoulder like she wasn't planning to let it out of her reach. She stepped down from the coach and stood still for a moment, not the way someone stands when they're overwhelmed or nervous, but the way someone stands when they're gathering information. Her eyes moved from left to right across the town, the dry goods store, the mill building at the far end of the main road, the grain elevator that leaned about 3 degrees off vertical, the mountains behind everything, and she did it methodically, like she was making a list. Then she looked at Wade. He stepped forward. "Miss Falcon? Mr. Mercer." Her accent was slight. Norwegian, the letters had said, though she'd lived in Minnesota for 4 years before writing. Her handshake was firm and brief. "The mill," she said. "That's it? At the end?" "That's it." She looked back down the road at it. From this distance, you could see the roof of the main building, the water tower that needed repainting, and the upper half of the wheel structure beside the creek. The wheel wasn't turning. It hadn't been turning reliably for longer than Wade liked to admit. "Good," she said. Then she picked up her end of the trunk and looked at him expectantly. Emmett, who had been watching all of this, uncrossed his arms and went inside without a word. Wade would hear about it later. He always did. The arrangement had been established through 6 letters exchanged over 4 months, and it was not romantic in the conventional sense. Wade had been honest about that from the first letter, which he'd considered a reasonable approach, and which had apparently attracted Anika Falcon precisely because of its directness. He was a sawmill owner, though the mill ground flour now had for 12 years, the name had stuck, who needed a capable partner to help run what had become an operation too complex for one person to manage alone. She was a woman with practical skills and no remaining family ties in Minnesota who wanted, as she'd put it, useful work in a place where useful work mattered. The marriage ceremony was performed the following morning by Judge Arterburn, who was in town to handle a property dispute and agreed to extend his stay by 1 day for a fee of $3, which Wade paid out of the $11.40. The judge was brief. There were no guests except for Marta Donnelly, who came because she'd heard and felt someone should be present, and who cried a little, which seemed to embarrass everyone, including herself. Annika did not appear moved one way or the other. She signed the register in a clear, precise hand, thanked the judge, and asked Wade if she could look at the books before supper. "The mill books?" he said. "Yes." I should warn you, they're not well organized." "That's all right," she said. "I'll organize them." Oh. The mill itself was built in 1871 by Wade's father, Clarence Mercer, who had the vision and the stubbornness typical of men who build things in difficult places. The creek that ran behind the property dropped enough elevation over 200 yards to drive a water wheel, and Clarence had spent 3 years proving that the flour he could grind there was worth the effort of getting grain to him and product back out. For a long time it had worked. The wheel turned, the stones ground, and Ash Hollow became the kind of town that existed because of the mill rather than in spite of it. Clarence died in 1879. Wade had been running the operation alone since then, with the help of a rotating cast of laborers who stayed until they got a better offer from somewhere else, which was always sooner than expected. His sister Ruth had kept the accounts for 2 years after their father's death, until she married a man in Helena and moved away. Since then, Wade had been keeping the accounts himself, which was the kind of task he was structurally unsuited for, and knew it. The books were kept in a wooden box under the desk in the small office attached to the main grinding room. They were 3 ledgers of varying ages, 2 notebooks that had overflowed into each other, and a collection of individual receipts and contracts that had been folded and unfolded enough times that some of them were held together only by habit. Annika sat down at the desk, set her satchel beside her, and opened the first ledger. She didn't say anything. Wade stood in the doorway for a moment, then decided he was in the way and went to start supper. She was still at the desk when he came to tell her the food was ready. She held up one finger without looking up. He went back and ate alone and decided not to take it personally. She came in 40 minutes later, sat across from him at the table, and ate what was left of the stew without complaint. The fire had died down and the room was cool. Outside, the wind was picking up, the way it did in the valley, before a front came through. "When did the wheel start underperforming?" she said. He stopped with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" "The output numbers." She tapped her finger on the table, not impatiently, more like she was aligning her thoughts. "In 1880 and 81, your monthly throughput averaged around 92 bushels per grinding session. By 83, it had dropped to 74. By last spring, it was 61. You've compensated partly by running longer sessions, but the efficiency loss is significant. Something changed in the mechanism around late 1882 or early 83. Wade set down his spoon. "The wheel lost a paddle in the spring flood of 83. We replaced it, but the replacements never run as true." "How many paddles currently?" 22, should be 24. "We keep meaning to add the last 2. She nodded, like this confirmed something. "There's also a contract in the second notebook, with Halverson Grain out of Miles City." Wade was quiet. "You're supplying them at 8 cents per bushel ground," she said. "What does Pearson's mill charge?" "Pearson's is in Miles City," she said. "I know. What do they charge?" He knew what they charged. He'd known for 2 years what they charged. He told himself the difference was offset by the transportation costs Halverson saved by sourcing locally, which was partly true and mostly a way of not looking at the number. 11 cents, he said. She didn't react with judgment or surprise. She just said, "How long has the Halverson contract been in place?" 4 years. "Did your father negotiate it?" "No, I did." He looked at the table. "First you're running things alone. Halverson came out personally. He made it seem like a good deal. Said he'd give us the volume to keep the wheel turning through slow months." "And did he?" Wade thought about it honestly. "In the beginning, yes. The last 2 years the volume's been lower. We're doing better on the open market." He paused. "I never renegotiated the rate." Annika nodded. She didn't say what she was thinking, but the look on her face wasn't contempt. It was more like a doctor looking at an X-ray. Professional, focused, cataloging what needed fixing. The contract has a renewal clause, she said. Did you know it auto-renews each January unless you give written notice by November 15th? He hadn't known that. He'd thought he'd known that, but sitting across from her now, he realized he'd never actually read that section of the contract closely enough. November 15th, he said. That's 38 days from now, she said. The fire had gone completely out. Neither of them moved to rebuild it yet. All right, Wade said finally. What else? She looked at him directly for the first time since they'd sat down. I'm going to need to see the wheel in daylight. Dip. She saw the wheel the next morning at first light, before most of Ash Hollow had finished breakfast. Wade watched her walk the structure twice, studying the paddles, crouching to look at the shaft housing, pressing her hand flat against the wooden frame and feeling for vibration the way you'd feel a horse's leg for a problem. This housing, she said, pointing to the left support bracket. How long has it been loose? I don't know that it is loose. She pressed it with her palm. There was a faint give, maybe an inch of play. Not dramatic, not nothing. It's been drifting, she said. See the wear marks? The shaft's been running slightly off-center. Not enough to seize, but enough to lose efficiency on every rotation. You're losing maybe 15 to 20% of the water's energy before it ever reaches the stones. Wade looked at the marks. They were subtle. He'd walked past that housing probably 400 times. My father built this in '71, he said. I know, it's good construction. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. She stood up and brushed the mud off her knees. The bracket needs to be reseated and the 2 missing paddles need to go in before the creek drops for winter. If we do that before freeze, you'll go into spring with something like a functional wheel instead of what you have now. That's not a small job. No, she agreed. It isn't. Behind them, on the road, Emmett Chow was walking to his feed store. He stopped when he saw Anika crouching by the wheel housing, tilted his head, then kept walking without commenting. 3 minutes later, his wife Dora came out of their house, looked at Anika, and went back inside. Wade saw all of this. He also saw Anika notice it and say nothing. They don't know what to do with you, he said, by way of explanation that probably wasn't necessary. They don't need to, she said. Where do you keep your tools? The problem with Ash Hollow was the same problem that existed in every small community that had been built on one thing. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and everyone had an opinion about how that business should be run, usually based on how it had always been run, which was not always the same as how it should be run. By the 3rd day of Anika's arrival, the town had formed a working theory about her. The charitable version was that she was a hard woman from a cold country who didn't understand how things were done here. The less charitable version, circulating primarily through Dora Chow and a woman named Betty Harlan who ran the laundry, was that she was cold and possibly strange, and that poor Wade Mercer had made a desperate decision he was going to regret. Neither theory took into account what she was actually doing. On the 3rd morning, she'd found the secondary ledger, the one Ruth Mercer had kept before Helena, and spent 4 hours cross-referencing it with the more recent accounts, building a picture of the mill's performance across 12 years that Wade had never seen in its entirety. She drew it out on paper in a way that wasn't elaborate, just a simple set of lines showing what the operation had been capable of and what it was producing now and what the gap between those 2 numbers represented in actual money. She put the paper on the desk in front of Wade without ceremony. He looked at it for a long time. The gap was not small. Over 3 years, accounting for what the mill should have produced at full efficiency versus what it had actually produced, the difference was somewhere between $400 and $500. Not all of it recoverable. You couldn't go back in time. But enough to understand that the mill wasn't failing because frontier milling was dying. It was failing because of specific fixable problems that had been allowed to compound. This is what's wrong with it, Anika said. The wheel, the contract, and the grade blending. Grade blending, Wade repeated. You're grinding everything to the same standard and selling it all at the same price. But flour isn't uniform. The first runs from a properly cleaned batch of hard winter wheat are finer and lighter than what comes out at the end of the session or from a softer grain. If you separate them and package them differently, The top-grade product can command significantly higher prices from bakeries and households that pay for quality. The lower-grade product still sells. It just sells to different buyers at a price that's honest. Bull? Mas. Wade leaned back in his chair. Nobody does that here. I know, she said. The other mills just grind and sell. I know. People are going to say, oh, I know what people are going to say, she said. Not sharply, just matter-of-factly. The question is whether it's correct. He looked at her across the desk. In the low light of the office, with the creak audible through the wall and the wheel making its imperfect sound, she looked like someone who had made a decision before she arrived and was simply working through the steps of it. Give me a week, she said. Let me prove the grade difference is real before we argue about whether to do anything with it. That was not an unreasonable request. He nodded. The week she asked for turned into 10 days, and the 10 days were not quiet ones. On the 4th day, Anika rode to Miles City to visit Halverson Grain without telling anyone she was going. She borrowed Wade's horse and left before 6 in the morning and returned after dark. She'd brought back a copy of the standard milling contract that Halverson offered to other operations in the territory, which was, as she'd suspected, considerably more favorable than the one Wade had signed 4 years ago. She put it next to the Mercer-Halverson contract on the desk without comment and waited while Wade read both. He gave other mills 11 cents, Wade said, and locked in volume guarantees, she said, and a renegotiation clause every 2 years. Wade's jaw was tight. I should have read mine more carefully. You were in your first year running things alone, she said. Halverson knew that. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed. It isn't. But it's a reason. And the two things are different. She slid the copy of the standard contract toward him. We write to him before November 15th. We tell him we're not renewing on current terms. We propose a new rate, 10.5 cents, which is below his standard but above what we're getting, with a proper volume guarantee and a 2-year renegotiation clause. And if he says no, then we let the contract lapse and we sell on the open market, which is actually what's been sustaining us the last 2 years anyway. She paused. He'll negotiate. He doesn't want to lose the supply. He'd rather give us something than have us go elsewhere. Wade was quiet for a moment. You went to Miles City and looked at his operation, didn't you? Not just the contract. She didn't deny it. His storage is at capacity. He needs product from multiple sources before December. He's not in a position to lose a supplier right now. How do you know his storage is at capacity? A very faint something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a smile. I asked the loading clerk how full the elevator was. People answer direct questions when you ask them plainly. On the 8th day, she ran the grade separation test. She cleaned and sorted a 50-bushel run of hard winter wheat with a precision that made Wade's current laborer, a young man named Cleet, who was 18 and had strong opinions about the right way to do things, visibly annoyed. She ran the first stone session, collected the initial output separately, adjusted the mill feed and ran a second pass, and then set the 2 batches side by side on the workbench. The difference was visible. Not dramatic, flour was flour, but the first run batch was noticeably whiter, finer, with less of the yellowish cast that came from brand contamination. She packed 2 small paper bags and sealed them and handed them to Wade. Take those to Marta Donnelly, she said. Don't tell her which is which. Ask her to bake the same recipe from each and tell you what she notices. Wade looked at the bags. Marta's going to ask questions. Yes, Anika said. Answer them honestly. He took the bags. Marta did ask questions, quite a few of them actually, and then she baked a batch of bread from each and presented Wade with 2 slices side by side the following afternoon with the gravity of someone performing an official duty. The difference was real. The bread from the first run flour was lighter, had a better crumb, rose more evenly. Marta, who had been cautiously skeptical about the whole situation, said, "Where did this come from?" Meaning the flour, not the bread. My mill, Wade said. Marta looked at the 2 slices. I've been buying from you for 8 years, she said. This one, she pointed to the better bread, I'd pay more for. How much more? She thought about it. 2 cents a pound, maybe. For consistent quality like this? Yes. Wade rode back to the mill and told Anika what Marta had said. Anika nodded and wrote something in her notebook and kept writing. By the end of the 10th day, they had a plan. Not a complete one, There were moving parts still unresolved, timber that needed to be sourced for the wheel repair, a letter to draft to Halverson that required careful wording, but the shape of it was clear. 3 repairs to the wheel mechanism, a renegotiated contract, or a clean break from Halverson, a grade separation process that added labor but opened a premium market, and a small but real improvement to the cleaning stage that Anika had sketched out from memory based on a method she'd seen used at a grain operation in Minnesota. Wade spread the plan across the desk and looked at it. "This is going to cost money we don't have," he said. "Some of it," she agreed. "The wheel repair is the largest cost. The rest is mainly labor and time. The wheel repair alone is probably $60 to $80 depending on timber prices." She didn't flinch from the number. "I've looked at what we have. If we defer the supply order to Hendricks until January and sell the premium flour run directly to 4 households here in town at market rate, we can cover most of it before the first frost." "That's tight." "Very," she said. He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was calm but not removed. There was something behind it, a steadiness that wasn't the same as indifference, like someone who understood the risk and had decided it was the right risk to take, and was waiting to see if he'd arrived at the same place. "You could have married someone with more working capital," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "I didn't." He looked back at the plan. The fire in the stove was going properly for the first time since she'd arrived. She'd fixed the damper on day 2, which had apparently been partially blocked, and the room was noticeably warmer. "There's something else," he said. "There usually is. Emmett Chow came to see me this morning, before you were up." She waited. "He told me the town's talking, that people think I've made a mistake, that a woman who shows up and immediately starts changing things doesn't understand what she's walked into." He paused. He wasn't being cruel about it. He meant it as a warning. Anika was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." She nodded. She reached across the desk and picked up the plan, folded it once, and set it on her side of the desk. "Are you going to think about it?" she said. Wade looked at her. He looked at the plan. He looked at the damper she'd fixed and the desk she'd organized and the ledger she'd turned from a source of dread into something he could actually read and understand. He thought about Marta Donnelly's 2 slices of bread. "No," he said. She nodded again, like that was the answer she'd expected. Not because she was arrogant about it, but because she'd done the work of being worth trusting, and she knew it. "Then we start on the wheel Monday," she said. "I'll write the Halverson letter tonight." Outside, the creek ran cold and steady in the darkness. The wheel turned its imperfect half-turns, losing efficiency with every rotation, doing what it could with what it had. It had been doing that for a long time. It wasn't going to have to do it much longer. Cleet, leaving the mill building after his shift, passed the lit office window and glanced in out of habit. He saw Anika at the desk, writing, and Wade standing behind her looking at the same page. He watched for a moment, then kept walking. He'd tell his mother about it later, the way he told her most things. He didn't have the words yet for what he'd seen. He'd work on it. The Halverson letter went out on a Wednesday. The wheel repair began the following Monday, 4 days before the first real freeze of the season. Anika worked alongside Cleet and a second laborer named Dix that Wade brought in for the week, and she did not stand back and supervise. She carried timber, held housing brackets in place while they were bolted, and spent 40 minutes on her knees in cold creek water checking the shaft alignment by hand when the initial fit didn't sit right. Cleet watched her do all of this with an expression that went through several stages before settling somewhere between surprised and unwillingly impressed. "You done this kind of work before?" he asked her on the 3rd day, when they were fitting the new paddles. "Not exactly this," she said. "I grew up on a farm. You learn what you need to. Farms don't usually have mill wheels." "No, but they have equipment that breaks, and the person who knows how to fix it is usually the one who paid attention instead of assuming someone else would." She handed him the end of a bolt. "Hold that." He held it. "Straight," she said. He straightened it. The wheel, when they finally let it run free on the 4th afternoon, turned with a smooth persistence that it had not had for years. The sound was different, quieter, more even, without the slight wobble that Wade had stopped hearing because he'd heard it too long. He stood on the bank with his arms crossed and watched it, and didn't say anything for a moment. That's what it's supposed to sound like, Anika said beside him. Not triumphant, just accurate. I forgot, Wade said. She looked at him, then looked back at the wheel. You'll remember it now, she said. The creek moved. The wheel turned. Ash Hollow went about its business around them, mostly unaware that something had just shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but the way things shift when the right piece finally goes into the right place. It wasn't the end of anything. If anything, it was just the beginning of what they'd actually have to fight for. But the wheel turned, and it turned true. The Halverson letter came back in 9 days. Wade found it in the stack of mail Frank Obie left at Donnelly's on his Tuesday run, sandwiched between a seed catalog and an overdue notice from the hardware supplier in Billings. He recognized the return address before he fully registered what he was looking at, and he stood there in the middle of the dry goods store for a moment before he opened it. Marta Donnelly was watching him from behind the counter with the particular attention she gave to things that were none of her business. He opened the letter. Halverson had written back personally, which was either a good sign or a bad one. Wade wasn't sure which. The letter was 2 pages in a cramped commercial hand that was difficult to read quickly. He read it twice in the store, nodded once to Marta, who was clearly dying to ask, and walked back to the mill. Anika was in the grinding room, working through a run of wheat with cleat. She had her sleeves rolled and there was flour dust on her forearms. She looked up when he came in, and he handed her the letter without preamble. She read it faster than he had. She turned the second page, read the bottom, and looked up. He's offering 9 cents, she said. I saw. And a volume floor of 400 bushels per quarter. No ceiling. I saw that too. She set the letter on the corner of the workbench, away from the flour dust. It's better than what we have. It's not what we asked for. No, she said. It isn't. She thought for a moment. He's testing us. He wants to know if we'll take the first counter or push back. Cleet, who had been very deliberately not listening from across the room, failed to maintain that performance and looked over. Anika didn't acknowledge it. Write him back, she said to him. 10 cents. Volume floor of 350? We go lower on the floor because we can absorb that. But we want the renegotiation clause, and we want it in writing that the rate applies to all grades we deliver, not just standard. Wade looked at her. The all grades clause. If we're going to separate the premium product and sell it direct, we need to be clear that our Halverson supply is the standard grade flour only. If we don't specify that in the contract, he can argue later that the premium run falls under his arrangement. She'd thought further ahead than he had. That was becoming a familiar experience. He picked up the letter and folded it. I'll write him tonight, he said. Write him this afternoon, she said, and keep it short. Long letters in negotiations look uncertain. The second letter went out Wednesday morning. While they waited for a response, Anika turned her attention to the cleaning process. The problem she'd identified wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing that was easy to walk past because it had always been there. The grain cleaning stage, before the wheat went to the millstones, used a hand-cranked fanning mill that was adequate but slow, and the screening mesh had 2 small tears that let through a percentage of light chaff and broken kernels that contaminated the final product more than they should have. New mesh cost $4. She replaced it herself on a Thursday morning, soldering the frame sections with a small kit she'd brought in her leather satchel, which, Wade was learning, contained a fairly remarkable range of small tools and materials that she'd assembled over years of solving problems in environments where you couldn't easily send away for things. Where did you learn to do that? He asked, watching her work the solder. Minnesota, she said. The operation I worked at before coming here. The owner was 73 and his hands shook. Either I learned to fix things or they didn't get fixed. What happened to him? She set down the soldering iron and tested the mesh with her thumb. He died in February. His son sold the property to a land company in April. She paused. That's when I answered your advertisement. Wade was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. He had a good life, she said. He built something that lasted 40 years. The land company will probably put crops on it and forget there was ever a mill there. She picked up the iron again. That bothered me more than his death, honestly. She said it plainly, without self-consciousness about what it revealed. Wade filed it away. The fact that she measured loss in terms of what got forgotten, what got erased. It told him something about why she'd come here, and what she was actually invested in. Halverson's second letter arrived the following Tuesday. 9.5 cents. The volume floor at 350. The renegotiation clause, but written in language vague enough that it would be difficult to enforce. Anika read it at the kitchen table after supper, her elbows on the wood, her chin resting on one folded hand. She turned the second page over and looked at the back of it, which was blank. "He's still testing," she said. "Maybe he's just not going above 9.5, Wade said. "He went up 0.5 cents in 3 days." She set the letter down. If he was at a ceiling, he would have said so in the first response. "You can't know that." "No," she admitted, "but the vague renegotiation language is a tell. He wrote that in himself. You can see it's a different ink from the rest of the letter, which means his office didn't draft it. He added it after, which means it mattered to him enough to do it personally, which means he intends to use it at some point." She tapped the letter. "We counter with 10. We offer to come down to 9.75 as a final concession, but we don't lead with that. And we send revised renegotiation language, specific, date-bound. If he rejects the language, we walk." Wade looked at her across the table. The lamp was low and she looked tired in the way she sometimes did in evenings, not defeated. Tired, but the kind that came from spending every hour of daylight being very precise about things and not quite being able to turn it off when the day ended. "What if he walks first?" Wade said. "Then we sell on the open market through winter, and we use the premium grade process to build direct accounts in town and with the settlements east of the ridge." She met his eyes. "We don't need Halverson. It would be easier with him. But we don't need him." "You're sure?" "I'm sure of the numbers," she said. "I'm never sure of people." That was an honest answer. He respected it more than a confident one would have been. He wrote the third letter that night. It went out Thursday. While the Halverson negotiation moved at the pace of postal correspondence, the mill itself was changing. The repaired wheel made a difference that showed up immediately in the output numbers. Not stunning, not a transformation overnight, but a real and measurable improvement. The grinding sessions that had been averaging 61 bushels were now running at 73, 75, occasionally pushing 80 on a good day with clean grain. The sound of the mechanism had changed, and Cleet had noticed, and one afternoon he'd said to Anika, with the careful casualness of someone who didn't want to seem impressed, "The stone's running better." "Yes," she said, "whatever you did with the housing." "The bracket," she said. "It was losing energy through vibration. Tightening the fit reduced the loss." He nodded slowly. "My father runs a blacksmith operation in Glendive," he said. "He always said you could tell everything about a machine by the sound it made." "Your father's right." Cleet seemed to struggle with something for a moment. "I didn't think it was going to work," he said. "The wheel repair. I thought it was going to be a lot of work and come out the same." "I know you did," she said. "You weren't shy about it." He flushed slightly. "I wasn't trying to be difficult." "I know that too." She handed him the clipboard with the day's output log. "Mark the session total. I want to track this week against the same week last month." He took the clipboard. It wasn't an acceptance exactly, and it wasn't a warm moment. She wasn't built for warm moments during working hours, but it was something. He marked the total and handed it back, and after that he stopped second-guessing her methods out loud, which was its own kind of progress. Oh. The grade separation went into regular practice in the mill's third week under Anika's system. It added roughly 40 minutes to each grinding session. The sorting, the separate packaging, the record-keeping, and it created a product that Wade began selling directly to households in Ash Hollow at a price point 2 cents above his standard rate. 6 households took him up on it immediately. 3 more came the following week after Marta Donnelly mentioned the bread quality to anyone who would listen, which in a town of Ash Hollow's size was essentially everyone. What it did to the mill's weekly revenue was not dramatic. It was not the kind of turnaround that made a man feel like his problems were solved, but it was real money where there had not been real money before, and it came without Halverson's involvement, which meant it was entirely theirs. Emmett Chow bought a 5-pound bag of the premium flour on a Friday afternoon, studying it with the skeptical thoroughness he brought to most things. He turned it over in his hands, looked at the color, put it back on the counter. "What makes it different?" he said to Wade. "First-run product from cleaned grain," Wade said. "Separate process." Emmett looked at the price. 2 cents over standard. "Yes." Marta's been talking about her bread. I know. Emmett looked at the bag for another moment, then picked it up. I'll take it, but if it's not what she said, I'm not buying it again. Fair enough, Wade said. Emmett left. He came back the following week for 2 bags. Dora Chow was less straightforward about it. She came to the mill on a Tuesday, which was slightly unusual. Most people sent their hired help for grain or came on Fridays when Wade ran the retail window. And she asked to speak to Anika directly, which was more unusual still. Anika was in the office. She came out wiping her hands on a cloth and looked at Dora without particular expression. Dora Chow was a practical woman, and she knew it about herself. She had been born in California and had come to Montana Territory with her husband 20 years ago, and she had built a life there through sheer organizational will, and she recognized that quality in other women even when she didn't like them. She wasn't sure yet whether she liked Anika. I want to ask you something directly, Dora said. All right, Anika said. Are you staying? Anika looked at her. Staying? In Ash Hollow, some people seem to think... Dora paused, choosing her words with the care of someone who believed precision mattered. There's a feeling among some people that you came here for a situation and that once things are stable, you'll have accomplished what you came for and you'll go. Anika was quiet for a moment. Who thinks that? Several people. It doesn't matter who. It might matter to me. Dora shook her head. It matters to the town whether the miller's wife is someone who intends to be here long term. That's all I'm asking. Anika folded the cloth she'd been holding and set it on the bench beside her. She looked out through the open door of the mill at the wheel turning in the mid-morning light, then back at Dora. I didn't come here for a situation, she said. I came here for work that was worth doing. She paused. The mill is worth doing. I intend to stay. Dora studied her for a moment with the look of a woman who had developed a reliable instinct for when people were telling her the truth. Then she nodded. I'll tell Emmett, she said, which seemed to serve as a conclusion to something. She bought a bag of standard flour and left. Anika watched her go, then went back into the office. She sat down at the desk and looked at the output log for a moment without really seeing it. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Halverson's third response arrived on a November morning when the temperature had dropped hard overnight and the ground was iron solid before 6. The response was brief, half a page, and it gave them 10 cents per bushel with the renegotiation language Anika had drafted, date-bound and specific, with a small modification to the volume floor that moved it to 300 bushels per quarter. She read it at the kitchen table before Wade was fully awake. When he came in and saw her expression, he stopped. What is it? She looked up. He took it. He stood in the doorway. All of it? The rate. The renegotiation language. He moved the volume floor to 300, which is actually better for us. Less obligation, more flexibility if we need to redirect product to the direct sale accounts. Wade crossed the room and read it over her shoulder. He read it twice. Then he straightened up and stood there with his hands at his sides. 10 cents, he said. As of January 1st, she was already reaching for her notebook. We need to calculate what this changes about the winter production schedule. If we're committing 300 bushels a quarter to Halverson at 10 cents, we need to plan the premium run separately to avoid cross-contamination of the grade records. Anika. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't fully cataloged yet. Not gratitude exactly, and not relief, though both of those things were in it. Something more direct than either. You were right, he said, about all of it. The contract, the wheel, the flour grades. He paused. I should have said this before. She looked at him for a moment. You trusted me before you had proof, she said. That's harder. It wasn't graceful about it. No, she agreed. It wasn't. A very small something moved across her face. Neither was I. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The kitchen was cold. The fire hadn't been going long enough, and the early light through the window was the flat gray of November. Not warm. Neither of them moved to make it more comfortable than it was. What do we do now? He said. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. Now we build the winter production schedule, and we talk about the storage problem. The storage problem. If we're running separate grades and fulfilling a Halverson contract on top of direct accounts, we need more dry storage space before spring. The current annex can't hold what we're going to be producing. She was already writing. There's a section of the east wall that could be extended without major structural work. I've been looking at it. Wade watched her write. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the second week, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you say something earlier? Because it wasn't the most urgent problem earlier, she said, without looking up. Everything has a sequence. You fix the most broken thing first. He thought about that. He thought about the bracket on the wheel housing, the Halverson contract, the mesh on the fanning mill. The sequence she'd worked through without being asked to, without making it a performance of competence, just moving through the list of what needed doing in the order it needed to be done. All right, he said, show me what you're thinking on the storage. She turned the notebook toward him and began to explain. Outside, the wheel turned in the cold air, steady and even, and the creek ran hard with snowmelt from the peaks. It was a difficult time of year to be doing what they were doing. There would be harder times ahead before easier ones. But the numbers were real. The contract was real. The wheel was turning the way it was built to turn. That was not nothing. In this country, in this season, that was very far from nothing. Cleet showed up at 7 and found them still at the kitchen table with the notebook between them, and the morning barely started. And he stood in the doorway for a moment, trying to figure out if he was interrupting something. He decided he wasn't exactly, and came in and put the kettle on without being asked, which was also a kind of progress. Nobody said anything about it. They just kept working. The storage extension took 3 weeks to build and cost $41 in lumber, which was $11 less than Anika had estimated, because Cleet's uncle ran a small sawmill operation outside of Forsyth and owed Cleet a favor of unspecified origin that Cleet was willing to convert into discounted timber. Wade did not ask about the nature of the favor. Cleet did not volunteer it. The lumber arrived on a flatbed on a Tuesday, and they framed the extension over 4 days in temperatures that dropped below freezing each night and barely climbed above it during the day. By December, the storage was functional, rough around the edges but solid, and the mill was running a production schedule that Anika tracked in a new ledger she'd bought in Miles City, cleaner than the ones Wade had inherited, organized by date and grade and buyer in a system that made the numbers legible at a glance. The Halverson contract sat in the desk drawer, signed by both parties, and the rate of 10 cents per bushel would begin with the January delivery. The direct accounts in town had grown to 14 households and 2 small commercial buyers. The bakery that Marta Donnelly's sister-in-law ran out of her kitchen on the east side of town, and a boarding house on the Billings Road that went through a significant amount of flour per week. The premium-grade product was moving at a price that still seemed slightly unreal to Wade when he wrote it in the ledger, though Anika had told him to stop being surprised by it. It's not a surprise, she'd said. It's what the product is worth. You were selling it below value before. I know that now. You knew it then too, she said. You just didn't have proof. He'd let that sit without argument because she wasn't wrong. What the numbers looked like by the 3rd week of December was this. The mill was not yet profitable in any dramatic sense. There were still outstanding debts. The Billings hardware account, a smaller amount owed to the lumber yard in Miles City from a purchase the previous spring, and the operating costs were higher than they'd been before, because the new process required more careful labor, and Cleet was now being paid a rate that reflected his actual contribution rather than the rate of a man who could be replaced easily. But the trajectory had changed. The line in the ledger that Anika drew at the end of each week, a simple mark showing the week's net, had been moving in the right direction for 6 consecutive weeks, not always dramatically. Some weeks the movement was small enough that you had to look carefully to see it. But it was consistent, and consistency, as Anika had said more than once, was the thing that mattered. Wade had started to believe her. That was also a change. The 2 men arrived on a Thursday in the 2nd week of January, which was the kind of cold that settled into the valley and didn't move for days at a time, the sky white and low and the road into Ash Hollow rutted solid. They came in a hired coach from Billings, which was an unusual enough occurrence that Frank Obie mentioned it to 3 people before he'd finished unloading the mail. Their names were Aldous Prentice and Gerald Firth, and they represented a company called the Continental Milling Consortium, which was headquartered in Chicago and had been quietly acquiring grain processing operations across Montana Territory and the Dakotas for the better part of 2 years. Prentice was the senior man, 50s, heavy through the middle, expensive coat, the kind of authority that came from spending decades in rooms where the decisions were made. Firth was younger and quieter, the sort of man who took notes and didn't speak unless Prentice indicated it was time to speak. They came to the mill on Friday morning and introduced themselves at the door. Wade looked at their cards. He'd heard the name Continental Milling. It had come up in conversation with Halverson's clerk during one of Anika's Miles City visits, mentioned in the context of operations that had sold and operations that hadn't. He hadn't thought much about it at the time. "Come in," he said. Anika was in the grinding room. She came through when she heard voices and stood in the doorway to the office, wiping her hands, and looked at the two men with the same systematic attention she'd given Ash Hollow on the day she arrived. Prentice introduced himself to her with the slight adjustment of manner that some men made when a woman was present in a business context and they weren't entirely sure how to categorize her. He called her Mrs. Mercer, which was technically correct, and which she acknowledged with a single nod. "We'd like to discuss a potential transaction," Prentice said, settling himself into one of the office chairs with the comfort of a man accustomed to settling into chairs in other people's offices. "I'll be direct. The consortium has been evaluating operations in this region for some time. Your mill has come to our attention." "How?" Anika said. Prentice blinked slightly. "I beg your pardon? How did it come to your attention? We're a small operation in a small town. I'm curious what put us on your list." Prentice glanced at Firth, who opened a small notebook. "Our regional agent reported improvements in your output and a new grade separation process that's attracting attention from buyers in Miles City." Anika said nothing. She looked at Wade briefly. Not a significant look, just a check. Then back at Prentice. "What kind of transaction are you proposing?" Wade said. "A purchase," Prentice said, "of the property, the equipment, and the associated contracts. We would assume the outstanding debts and provide a cash payment above assessed value." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, which he set on the desk. "This is a preliminary figure. We're prepared to move quickly if there's interest." Wade picked up the paper and read the number. He read it twice. Then he set it down. It was $4,200. He had not seen a number like that attached to his name in any context he could remember. He was aware of his own breath for a moment, and the sound of the wheel outside, and the cold coming through the gap at the bottom of the door that he kept meaning to fix. Prentice was watching him with the practiced patience of a man who had done this before. Firth was writing something. Nika had picked up the paper and was reading it. Her face told Wade nothing. "We'd need time to consider it," Wade said. "Of course," Prentice said. "We're in Ash Hollow through Monday. We can meet again before we leave." He stood, buttoned his coat, and extended his hand. "It's a fair offer, Mr. Mercer. More than fair, given current assessed values in this territory." "I'll take that under advisement," Wade said. They shook hands. Anika did not shake hands with Prentice. She set the paper back on the desk and looked at it with the expression she used when she was calculating something. Prentice and Firth left. Cleet, who had been very still in the grinding room during all of this, appeared in the doorway afterward. "Who were those men?" he said. "Buyers," Wade said. Cleet looked at the desk. "Are you selling?" "I don't know yet," Wade said. Cleet looked at Anika. She didn't answer him. He went back to the grinding room. Muck. They didn't talk about it that afternoon. Wade went through the rest of the day's work without bringing it up, and Anika did the same, and it sat between them like weather. Present, unavoidable, not yet dealt with. After supper, Anika got her notebook. Not the production ledger, the older one, the one she did her calculations in, dense with numbers and small notations in the margins. She sat at the kitchen table and worked for 2 hours without speaking. Wade read a surveying pamphlet he'd been meaning to read for 3 months and managed to absorb about a third of it. At 9:30, she set down her pen. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. He set the pamphlet on the side table. "I'm thinking $4,200 is more money than this mill has ever represented in one number." "Yes." "I'm thinking the debts disappear, the hardware account, Miles City, whatever's left on the Hendricks order." "Approximately $600 total," she said, which leaves $3,600 after debt settlement. "That's still a significant amount," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "But," she was quiet for a moment, her hand flat on the notebook. "I've been running projections since January, not guesses, projections based on the actual numbers from the last 8 weeks. She turned the notebook toward him. If the current trajectory holds, and if the Halverson contract performs at the contracted volume, and if we add 2 more direct commercial accounts in the spring, which is conservative, the demand is there. The mill's annual net income by the end of next year is somewhere between $800 and $1,100. Wade looked at the numbers. He was better at reading them now than he'd been in October. That's 1 year, she said. Prentice's offer is equivalent to roughly 3.5 to 4 years of that income, paid now, all at once. That's how he calculated it. He's offering you a fair multiple on current value. She paused. But he's calculating on current value, not on what it's becoming. What's it becoming? She turned to a page near the back of the notebook. If we hold the mill for 5 years at this trajectory, and if the premium grade builds a reputation with settlements beyond the immediate area, which it will if we're consistent, the cumulative income over 5 years is somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000. Possibly more. The room was quiet except for the fire. Possibly more, Wade said. The premium product is the variable. If it finds larger commercial buyers, if a bakery in Miles City or one of the settlement stores takes a regular order, the upper end of that range increases significantly. He was looking at the numbers and also not quite seeing them. He was thinking about his father, who had built the wheel in 1871 and who had stood where Wade was standing for 20 years and never once been offered $4,200 to stop. He knows what it's becoming, Wade said. Anika looked at him. Say that again. Prentice. He knows what the trajectory is. That's why he's here now, not 6 months ago, not a year ago. He looked up from the notebook. 6 months ago, this place was worth what? Assessed value, maybe $800, $1,000? The 1882 county assessment was $940, she said quietly. He's not offering $4,000 because he thinks it's worth $4,000, Wade said. He's offering it because he thinks in 2 years it's worth $8,000, and he wants to own it before it gets there. Anika said nothing. She watched him work through it. What happens to a mill when the consortium takes it over? He said. She'd thought about this. They standardize it. Replace the small batch premium process with high-volume standard grinding. The direct accounts disappear. They're too small to service efficiently at that scale. The operation becomes a supply node for their regional distribution network. And the people who work here, Cleet would probably be kept on, possibly, at a rate the consortium sets, not one we negotiate. She paused. The mill stops being this mill. It becomes a piece of something larger. That's what they buy. The capacity. They don't need the character of the operation. They can't use it. Wade was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire needed a log, and he got up and put one in without interrupting what he was thinking. He sat back down. What's your actual recommendation? She looked at him steadily. I don't think you should sell. Tell me the risk of not selling. If the trajectory doesn't hold, if we lose the Halverson contract, or if a competing mill opens in the region, or if there's a bad harvest year, we're back to where we were in October, except we had a chance to take the money and didn't. She didn't soften it. There is genuine risk in saying no. But you still don't think we should sell? No, she said. I don't. Because of the numbers. Because of the numbers, she said, and because what Prentice is offering is a price for stopping. He's asking us to stop at the point where stopping is most tempting, which is exactly the point where stopping is most costly. Wade looked at her. In the lamplight, with the notebook open between them and the winter pressing against the windows, she looked like someone who had made her decision well before this conversation and was simply telling him what it was. If I say no, he said, Prentice isn't going to be happy. No. Men like Prentice, when they don't get what they want, they look for other ways to get it, she said. Yes, I've thought about that. And? She folded her hands on the notebook. The Halverson contract is signed. The direct accounts are personal relationships. They buy from us because they trust the product. If Prentice tries to interfere with our supply chain or our buyers, he has to do it in a small town where everyone sees what he does. She paused. That's actually a protection. He's used to operating in markets where his moves aren't visible. He doesn't know how visible everything is here. You're betting on the town, Wade said. I'm betting on the fact that Emmett Chow doesn't like being told what to buy, she said. and that Marta Donnelly has opinions she shares with everyone within a mile radius. A very faint dryness in her voice. Yes, I'm betting on the town. He sat back in his chair. He thought about $4,200. He thought about the wheel running true and the November ledger line moving in the right direction for 6 consecutive weeks. He thought about Prentice in his expensive coat, settling into a chair in someone else's office with the patience of a man who had done it before. I'm going to tell him no, Wade said. Annika looked at him for a moment without expression. Then she nodded once, picked up her pen, and turned to a fresh page in the notebook. Then I need to adjust the spring production projection, she said. If he retaliates through Halverson, I want to know exactly what our floor looks like without that contract. He'd have to get to Halverson first. He might try. Halverson is independent, but he's not immune to pressure from a Chicago consortium. She was already writing. We need a contingency. If we lose the Halverson contract in the next 6 months, the direct accounts have to carry the operation until we find another bulk buyer. Can they? She did the arithmetic without looking up, running numbers in a column with the quick efficiency of someone for whom numbers moved in a different way than they did for most people. She finished, checked it, and looked up. Barely, she said. If cleats hours are reduced in April and May and we defer the east wall repair until summer, it would be a hard 6 months. Harder than the last 3 months? She considered this genuinely. About the same, she said. He nodded. He was not particularly comforted, and he could tell she knew it. I'll go see Prentice in the morning, he said, before he comes here. Don't go to him, she said. Let him come. He looked at her. You went to Halverson, she said. That was right, because you needed information and you needed to see his operation. Prentice came to you. That's his acknowledgement that you have something he wants. Don't give that back. Wade sat with that for a moment. You think about things like that. The positioning, she said. Yes, it matters in negotiations. Where you stand, who moves first. Your father teach you that? My father taught me to split firewood and keep accounts, she said. I learned the rest from watching what worked and what didn't. She closed the notebook. Prentice will come Monday morning. Be here. Be calm. Tell him no and give him as little explanation as possible. Short letters in negotiations. The corner of her mouth moved. Something like that. Prentice came Monday at 10 in the morning, as though arriving at a reasonable business hour might suggest that this was a routine matter rather than what it actually was. Firth was with him, notebook out before he was fully through the door. Wade met them in the office. Annika was in the grinding room, which Prentice probably took as an indication that the decision was Wade's alone to make. It was not an indication of that. Prentice sat down. I hope you've had time to consider our offer. We have, Wade said. It's a strong offer, Mr. Mercer. I want to be clear about that. The current assessed value of this property. We're not selling, Wade said. Prentice stopped. The pause was brief and practiced. I see. He settled back slightly. May I ask what your reasoning is? The mill's not at its value yet, Wade said. We're not interested in selling at the midpoint. Our figure reflects a significant premium over current. I know what your figure reflects, Wade said. We're not selling. Prentice looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite what Wade had expected. It wasn't anger, it was something cooler and more deliberate, the look of a man reassessing the room he was in. I want to be honest with you, Prentice said, and his voice had changed slightly. Less the tone of a man closing a deal, more the tone of a man choosing his words. The consortium has significant reach in this territory. Supply chains, distribution networks, relationships with buyers at a regional level. A small independent operation that positions itself against those networks can find things more difficult than they need to be. Wade looked at him. Is that a warning? It's information, Prentice said. I'm giving it to you in good faith. Then I'll give you some in return, Wade said. Ash Hollow is a small town. Everything that happens here is known by everyone in it within a day. If the consortium's regional relationships begin affecting a local operation for no commercial reason, that'll be known too. He paused. And it'll be known what direction it came from. Prentice studied him. Whatever recalculation was happening behind his eyes, he kept it from his face. He stood. He buttoned his coat. The offer is on the table through the end of the month. If you reconsider, contact our Chicago office. He set a card on the desk. I hope you'll think carefully, Mr. Mercer. We will, Wade said. They left. Cleet, in the grinding room doorway, watched them walk up the road toward the coach stop without expression. Anika came out of the grinding room and stood beside Wade, and they both watched the two men until they turned the corner at Donnelly's and were gone. He threatened you, Anika said. It wasn't a question. Diplomatically, Wade said. He called it information. She was quiet for a moment. Are you worried? Wade thought about it honestly. The honest answer was yes, in the way that a reasonable person is worried when a large organization indicates it can make things hard for them. He was not frightened in the way Prentice probably intended, but he was not pretending it was nothing. Some, he said. She nodded. Good. We should be some worried. It keeps us careful. She turned back toward the office. I'm going to write to Halverson today. Not about Prentice, just a regular business letter confirming the January delivery and asking about their spring volume needs. Why? Because it establishes a communication pattern, she said. If Prentice does contact Halverson, I want there to already be recent correspondence from us on record that shows the relationship is active and in good standing. She picked up her pen. Paper trails matter. Wade looked at her. You already thought about this, he said, before Prentice even came. I thought about it Saturday, she said. I should have thought about it sooner. She sat down and began to write. The wheel turned outside. The January cold sat on the valley like something that intended to stay. Somewhere up the road, a coach was carrying Aldous Prentice and his quiet notebook keeper back toward Billings, and whatever he was planning, it wasn't over, but neither were they. Halverson wrote back in 8 days. The letter was friendly in tone, professional, measured, the kind of correspondence between parties who had found their working arrangement satisfactory and saw no reason to disturb it. He confirmed the January delivery schedule, noted that his spring volume needs would likely increase based on demand from his Miles City accounts, and mentioned in a brief postscript that he had received an inquiry from a Chicago firm about regional supply partnerships, which he had declined to pursue as his current arrangements were meeting his needs. Anika read that postscript twice. Then she handed the letter to Wade without comment and watched him read it. Prentice contacted him, Wade said. Within 2 weeks of leaving here, she said. That was fast. And Halverson told him no. And then told us about it. She took the letter back and set it in the desk drawer with the contract. That's not nothing. It wasn't. It meant that Halverson valued the relationship enough to alert them to pressure being applied, which meant the paper trail Anika had established with her January letter had done what she'd intended it to do. It also meant that Prentice had moved quickly, which told them something about how seriously the consortium took the refusal. Wade sat with that information for a day and then decided to stop thinking about Prentice entirely and focus on what he could control, which was the mill. It was Anika who had told him, somewhere in the middle of December, that the most effective response to external pressure was internal momentum. You couldn't stop a large organization from trying things. You could make yourself difficult to dislodge by being genuinely good at what you did. He'd thought it was a reasonable philosophy at the time, and he thought it was even more reasonable now. Standing in January with the Halverson contract intact and the wheel running and the ledger showing 7 consecutive weeks of positive movement. The problem was the exhibition. He hadn't intended to enter the Territorial Agricultural Exhibition. It wasn't something he'd thought about seriously since his father's time. Clarence Mercer had entered twice in the 1870s, won a second-place ribbon for grain quality in 1876, and considered the whole enterprise worthwhile enough to mention occasionally. Wade had attended twice as a spectator and found it interesting, but not something that seemed relevant to a mill that was fighting to stay solvent. The idea came from Dora Chow, which was fitting in retrospect because Dora had a talent for identifying leverage that other people missed. She came into the mill on a Wednesday in late January, which was no longer unusual. She had become something like a regular visitor over the past month, stopping in to buy flour and staying sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes to talk with Anika about things that ranged from practical to purely social. It was not a warm friendship exactly. It was the friendship of two competent women who had found that talking to each other was more useful than talking to most people, which was its own category of connection. She set a printed sheet on the desk. The exhibition is in March, she said. Billings. They have a flour quality division. Anika looked at the sheet. The entry fee is $3, Dora continued. The judging criteria are whiteness, fineness, consistency, and baking performance. I've been eating your premium flour for 2 months. She paused. You'd win. Annika read the sheet. You don't know that. I know what the other mills in this region are producing, Doris said. I've been buying flour my whole life. I know what the difference looks like. Annika set the sheet down. She looked at Wade, who had come in from the grinding room when he heard Dora's voice. A regional exhibition, he said. Billings, Annika said. March. He read the sheet. The exhibition had been running for 11 years and drew entries from operations across a 500-mile radius. The flour division had 16 registered entrants last year. The first place award came with a certificate and more practically a published notice in the Territorial Agricultural Gazette that was read by commercial buyers, settlement store owners, and food operations from Billings to the Dakota border. That's not a small audience, Wade said. No, Annika said. They looked at each other. $3, he said. Yes. We'd have to transport samples. That's a day in Billings, maybe 2. Yes. He looked at the sheet again, then at her. Do you think we'd win? She considered the question with the honesty she brought to most things. I think we'd be competitive, she said. Whether we win depends on what else is entered. I can't know that in advance. But the product is good. The product is genuinely good, she said. What we've been producing for the last 6 weeks from a clean, hard winter wheat run is as fine as anything I've seen from an operation this size. He nodded once. Enter it. Doris, who had been watching this exchange with the composed satisfaction of someone whose suggestion had gone the way they expected, picked up her usual order of premium flour and left without further comment. The weeks between January and the March exhibition were not quiet ones. Prentice did not reappear in Ash Hollow, but his presence was felt in smaller ways. In February, a buyer from the consortium's regional network visited 2 of Ash Hollow's neighboring settlements and offered significant discounts on bulk flour from consortium-supplied mills. It was a straightforward move, undercut on price to pull buyers away from independent operations in the area, and it was not subtle enough to be mistaken for coincidence. Wade heard about it from a settlement storekeeper named Bartlett, who rode into Ash Hollow on a Thursday specifically to tell him. Consortium man came through Ridgecrest on Monday, Bartlett said. He was a weathered man, mid-50s, who had been buying standard flour from Wade for 4 years on a seasonal basis. Offered me standard grade at 7.5 cents per pound. That's below what you charge. That's below what it costs to produce it at that quality, Wade said. I know. Bartlett turned his hat in his hands. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't want to give him a flat no without talking to you first. Wade looked at him. I appreciate that. You've been fair with me, Bartlett said. I'm not interested in switching on price alone if the quality doesn't hold. He paused. But 7.5 is 7.5. I've got a budget to run. Wade went and got Annika. She came in, listened to what Bartlett had said, and asked 2 questions. What volume was Bartlett typically ordering, and what was his primary use? Resale to households, or supply to a commercial operation in the settlement? Resale mostly, Bartlett said. Some goes to the boarding house on the East Road. She nodded. The boarding house buys on quality, not price? They have guests coming through on the Billings run. They care about the baking. Then separate the orders, she said. We'll supply the boarding house account at current premium rate, which is appropriate for what they need. For the household resale volume, we can meet you at 8 cents, not 7.5 because we can't produce at 7.5 without cutting quality, but 8. That's a real concession. Bartlett looked at her, then at Wade. 8, she said, and we'll prioritize your spring delivery date. If the consortium's regional supply gets tight in March, which it sometimes does when they're moving product around their network, you'll have confirmed supply from us first. Bartlett thought about it for a moment, then he nodded. 8 on the household stock. Premium rate on the boarding house supply. He put his hat back on. That works. After he left, Wade looked at Annika. We just cut our margin on his account. By 1.5 cents on part of the order, she said, in exchange for keeping the account and blocking a consortium entry point into the settlement. She was already writing the adjusted price in the ledger. It costs us less than losing the account entirely, And Bartlett goes home having gotten a concession, which means he'll tell people he was treated fairly. That's worth more than the margin we gave up. Wade watched her write. How many more of those conversations do you think we're going to have? Depends on how many settlements Prentice's man visits, she said. Probably 2 or 3 more in the next month. She looked up. We respond the same way each time. We can't compete with consortium pricing at volume. We compete on relationship and reliability. That's a thin line to walk. Yes, she said, but it's ours. She was right about the 2 or 3 more conversations. There were 3, spread across February and the first week of March, each one a variation on the Bartlett situation. A buyer who'd been approached by the consortium's regional man with prices that looked attractive until you thought carefully about what you were actually getting. Wade handled 2 of them himself, applying the logic Annika had laid out. She handled the third, a buyer from a settlement called Draper's Crossing who came in specifically skeptical and left with a modified order and, as best Wade could tell, a changed opinion about what the mill was. What the mill was, this was the thing that had shifted, and Wade found himself thinking about it in the way you think about something that happened quietly enough that you didn't notice until it was already true. The mill was no longer the place that had always been there, running well enough, a fact of Ash Hollow, like the dry goods store and the livery. It had become something with a specific character. People in town described it differently than they had 4 months ago. Marta Donnelly said it was the best flower in the territory and said it loudly and often. Dora Chow mentioned it to people passing through. Emmett, who was constitutionally unable to give uncomplicated praise, told a buyer from Billings that if you needed quality grain product, you might as well go to Mercer's because they were being serious about it. Being serious about it. That was Emmett's version of high praise, and both Wade and Annika understood it. Cleet had changed too, in ways he probably wouldn't have articulated if you'd asked him. He'd started taking the grade separation process personally, checking the output himself before logging it, occasionally rerunning a batch he felt hadn't come through clean enough, doing things Wade hadn't asked him to do because he'd decided they were worth doing. He'd also started showing up 10 minutes early, which was a small thing and not a thing anyone commented on, but Wade noticed. One afternoon in late February, Cleet had asked Annika if she knew anyone who'd written down the grade separation method, as in whether it existed in any published form. Some of it, she said. There's a paper from a grain operation in Minnesota that describes a similar process. I have a copy. Could I read it? She'd looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. I'll find it tonight. She'd given him the paper the next morning, 8 pages of dense technical writing that he'd taken home and apparently read twice because he came back with questions that were specific enough to tell you he'd been paying attention. These were the things that happened in the margins of the larger story, unremarked on, unplanned, just the natural consequence of people being around work they were starting to care about. The exhibition was on a Saturday in the second week of March, in the Agricultural Hall on the south end of Billings. They drove in Friday evening and stayed at a boarding house on the main road, Wade and Annika in one room, Cleet in a smaller room at the end of the hall, because Annika had decided at the last minute that Cleet should come, a decision she explained to Wade with the simple logic that he'd contributed to the product and should see what it was entered in. The entry samples were packed in a wooden case Annika had built specifically for transport, each sample sealed, labeled in her clear hand, cushioned against the road. There were 3 samples, the standard grade winter wheat flour, the premium first-run product, and a sample of what she'd begun calling select grade, a smaller batch produced from the finest cleaned wheat with an additional pass through the screens, which was finer still and which she'd been testing for 2 months. Wade had not known about the select grade until she'd shown it to him in February. When did you develop this? He'd said. December, she said. I've been running trials alongside the regular production to test consistency. It's ready. Why didn't you tell me? She'd considered the question. I wasn't sure it was ready in December. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. He'd looked at the sample, whiter than the premium grade, almost luminous under the office lamp, finer than anything he'd seen from his own millstones. What do you price this at? 4 cents over standard, she'd said. Maybe 5 to a commercial buyer who understands what they're getting. Is there a commercial buyer in this territory who'll pay 5 cents over standard? There will be, she'd said, if we can show them what it does in the oven. He'd let that sit. He was getting better at letting her statements sit without immediately arguing with them. The exhibition hall was larger than either of them had expected. 16 entrants in the flower division had become 22 by the entry deadline, drawn from operations as far as the Dakota border, and one entry from an industrial operation in Butte that ran steam-powered grinding on a scale that made the Ash Hollow mill look like a kitchen appliance by comparison. Cleet stood in front of the Butte operations display table for a moment with his hands in his pockets. "That's a big mill," he said. "Size isn't the judging criterion," Anika said, and kept walking. The judging took 3 hours. Wade and Anika waited in the exhibition hall, walking the other displays, talking to other operators in the way of people who are curious about what their counterparts are doing and also watching carefully for information. Cleet bought a meat pie from a vendor outside and ate it on the steps and watched the street. Wade talked for 20 minutes with an operator from Glendive named Pearson, who ran a water-powered mill of similar scale and who was entering for the 3rd time and had never placed above 4th. He was a methodical man who asked good questions, and when Wade mentioned the grade separation process, Pearson went still for a moment. "Your separating runs by quality?" Pearson said. "My wife's system," Wade said. It was the first time he'd said it that way. My wife's system. And it felt accurate in a way that some descriptions don't. "How long has she been working with mills?" 12 years, roughly. Different operations. Pearson looked across the hall to where Anika was examining another entry's sample jars with the focused attention she brought to anything technical. "She entered the select grade?" "How did you know we had a select grade?" Pearson nodded at the display table. "Because the sample jars are labeled differently than anything else here. Most operations bring 1 or 2 grades. You brought 3, and the 3rd one's in a different jar than the others. Darker glass." He looked at Wade. "She wants to protect it from the light during judging. That tells you she knows what light does to flour oxidation over a few hours." Wade looked at the jars. He hadn't thought about why she'd chosen different jars. "Yeah," he said, "she entered the select grade." Pearson nodded slowly. "Good luck," he said, and he meant it. The results were announced at 3 in the afternoon by a judge named Caldwell, who was the head of the Territorial Grain Commission and who approached the announcement with the solemnity appropriate to something he'd been thinking about for 3 hours. There was a small crowd by that point, operators, their families, a handful of buyers and commercial representatives who attended the exhibition specifically because the results told them where to source product. 3rd place went to a mill from eastern Dakota. 2nd place went to Pearson from Glendive, which pleased Wade for reasons he couldn't entirely explain. Caldwell looked at his paper. 1st place, Flour Division, Premium and Select Grade category. Mercer Mill, Ash Hollow, Montana Territory. The crowd was not large and the response was not thunderous. It was the kind of announcement that lands with quiet significance rather than noise. People turning to look, a few nodding, the buyers in the back making notes. Cleet said, under his breath, something that was either "there it is" or possibly stronger language that Wade decided not to inquire about. Anika went forward to receive the certificate from Caldwell. He shook her hand and said something to her that Wade couldn't hear from where he was standing, and she nodded and said something back. She looked at the certificate once, folded it, and came back. She handed it to Wade. He looked at it. The words were formal and official and slightly ornate in the way certificates always were, and the name of the mill was printed in the center in capital letters. "You should have this," he said. "It belongs to the mill," she said. "The mill is yours." "Ours," he said. She looked at him. There was a pause that had some weight to it. "Ours," she agreed. They stood there for a moment in the noise of the exhibition hall, the crowd moving around them, Cleet already talking to someone he recognized from somewhere, the certificate between them holding a significance that neither of them was going to make into a speech. Then she said, "We should find Caldwell before he leaves. I want to talk to him about the commercial buyers who attend these exhibitions, specifically the one from Billings who's been standing in the back with a purchasing ledger for the last hour." Wade looked across the hall. There was, in fact, a man in the back with a purchasing ledger. "You noticed him during the judging," Wade said. "I noticed him when we came in," she said. "He's looked at our samples 3 times. She started moving through the crowd. "Come on." He followed her. Behind them, the wheel of the day kept turning, and somewhere up the road, Ash Hollow was going about its business without them. which it could now do for a day or two without anything going badly wrong, which was itself a measure of how far they'd come from October. Sad. The buyer's name was Sorensen, and he ran purchasing for 4 commercial bakeries across the Billings area. He was a practical man with a practical face, and he didn't pretend he hadn't been watching their table. "Your select grade," he said. "What's your production capacity?" Anika quoted him a number. It was honest, not inflated to seem impressive, not undersold to manage expectations, just the actual number. Sorensen wrote it down. "At what price point?" She told him. He looked at the number. "That's 4.5 cents over standard." "Yes. My bakeries currently buy premium at 2 over standard from a Billings supplier." "I know," she said. "I looked at what the Billings operations are producing before we entered today." She reached into her satchel and produced a small paper bag, sealed. "I brought a baking sample. If you have access to an oven this afternoon or this evening, I'd suggest comparing the crust rise and the crumb texture directly against what you're currently using." Sorensen looked at the bag. "You came prepared." "Yes," she said simply. He took the bag. He looked at Anika, then at Wade, then back at Anika. "I'll be in Ash Hollow in 3 weeks," he said. "If this performs the way I think it might, I'll want to discuss a regular arrangement." "We'll be there," she said. Sorensen left. Cleet, who had materialized at Wade's shoulder at some point during the conversation, watched him go. 4.5 over standard, Cleet said. "Yes," Anika said. "Per pound." Per pound. Cleet did the arithmetic in his head. From the expression on his face, the arithmetic arrived somewhere that surprised him. He said nothing further, which was probably the right response. Wade looked at Anika. She was watching Sorensen cross the hall toward the exit, her expression neutral, the leather satchel on her shoulder, flour dust still visible at the edge of her sleeve from the morning's sample preparation, which she hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered about. 4.5, he said. "It's what it's worth," she said. "We just had to show someone." They walked out of the exhibition hall into the March afternoon, which was cold in the way March in Montana is always cold, fighting with itself between seasons, not committing to either. The street was ordinary. The town around them was going about its business. Nothing looked different than it had 3 hours ago. But something was different, not fixed. There was still the spring production schedule, the storage that needed expansion before summer, the consortium's quiet pressure that hadn't fully let up, the debts that were smaller but not yet gone. Nothing was fixed in the way that things sometimes are in stories where a single moment resolves everything cleanly. What had changed was the direction. The direction was clear now in a way it hadn't been in October, and it was the right direction, and the people walking toward the boarding house on that March afternoon had built it out of nothing more dramatic than work and honesty and the willingness to trust each other when trusting was harder than not. The wheel at the mill in Ash Hollow was turning. Sorensen had a paper bag in his coat pocket. The certificate was folded in Wade's inside pocket against his chest. 3 weeks wasn't long. There was a lot to do before Sorensen arrived. They started planning it on the road home. Sorensen came 3 weeks later on a Tuesday, which was a grinding day. He arrived without the purchasing ledger this time, which Wade took as either a good sign or a bad one, until Sorensen explained that he'd left it at the boarding house because he didn't want to seem like he was there to negotiate before he'd seen the operation. He wanted to see the operation first. That was the kind of thing a serious buyer said, and both Wade and Anika registered it without commenting on it. They walked him through the mill in the order that made sense. The grain cleaning stage, the stone floor, the wheel housing, the storage extension with its separated bins for standard, premium, and select grades. Sorensen asked practical questions throughout, not the questions of a man performing interest, but the questions of someone who had been in enough operations to know what to look for, and was finding more than he expected. At the storage bins, he stopped and looked at the labeling system Anika had developed. Each bin marked with grade, date of run, source grain, and moisture reading at time of storage. "Moisture reading," he said. "Flour absorbs from the air," Anika said. "The moisture content at storage affects shelf life and baking behavior. If a buyer knows the reading, they can adjust their recipes accordingly and get consistent results even across different batches." Sorensen looked at the label for a long moment. "None of the operations I currently buy from do this." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know?" Because if they did, you'd have mentioned it as a standard expectation when we met in Billings. She said it without sharpness, just the logic of it. You didn't mention it, which means you've never seen it, which means no one's been doing it. Sorensen nodded slowly. He looked at the bins. He looked at the wheel through the open door, turning in the March light. Then he looked at Wade. "What's your current production capacity for select grade per month?" he said. Wade let Anika answer because she would answer it more accurately. She gave him the number. She gave him the honest number, not a projected number, not a hopeful number, the actual number from the last 6 weeks of tracked production. "Can you scale it?" Sorensen said. "Within limits," she said. "The select grade is constrained by the quality of incoming grain as much as by the process. We can't produce more select grade than the grain justifies. What we can do is improve our sourcing to increase the percentage of wheat that meets the threshold." What would that require? A standing arrangement with 1 or 2 grain suppliers who are willing to segregate and deliver to our quality specification. It exists. Most operations don't ask for it because the premium on source grain narrows the margin. Our process recovers that margin on the back end. Sorensen looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating something. "You've thought about the full supply chain?" "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to establish a regular arrangement, monthly delivery of select grade to my Billings accounts, standard grade for 2 of the others where the price point matters more than the grade." He named a price for the select. It was 4 cents over standard, not 4.5, which told you he was still a buyer even if he was a fair one. Anika said, 4.25. Sorensen said 4.125. Wade watched this happen with the particular feeling of a man watching someone else do something he could not have done himself and being glad they were on his side. 4.25, Anika said again. "The moisture labeling alone is worth the 1/8 cent in reduced waste on your end. You know it is." Sorensen looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was what men did when they were agreeing to something they'd already decided to agree to. 4.25, he said. They shook hands, all 3 of them. Cleet, who had been standing in the doorway to the grain room during all of this, turned around and went back to work with a very deliberate casualness that didn't fool anyone. But the Sorensen arrangement changed things in a way that was less like a transformation and more like a door opening onto a room that had been there the whole time. The monthly delivery commitment gave them the production rhythm Anika had been building toward. A predictable schedule that let them plan sourcing, manage the wheel's maintenance windows, and track efficiency in ways you couldn't track when orders were irregular. The Billings hardware debt was paid in full in April. The Miles City lumber account closed in May. Wade wrote both checks at the kitchen table on the same evening, not dramatically, just as part of a normal Tuesday, and set them aside to mail in the morning. Anika was across the table working through the summer production schedule. She didn't look up when he sealed the envelopes. "The last of it?" she said. "The last of it," he said. She wrote something in the notebook. "The margin we were putting toward debt service goes to the storage expansion now. We need to have the additional bins built before fall harvest." "We could take a week," he said, "before the next project starts." She looked up. "Not a long time," he said. "Just, the debt's gone. We've been running at this pace since October, 1 week." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite disagreement, more like a person encountering an idea they hadn't scheduled and finding it less unwelcome than expected. "A week," she said. 7 days. She closed the notebook. "All right." They went to Helena. Neither of them had been in years. Wade not since a surveying matter in 1881, Anika never in Montana at all. It was not a romantic trip in the storybook sense. It rained 2 of the 7 days. They ate at a restaurant on the second evening where the food was good and the service slow. And they talked for 3 hours over a meal that went cold at the edges and neither of them cared. They talked about the mill, which was inevitable, and about the grain sourcing problem, which was unavoidable. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, they talked about other things. Her father's farm outside Bergen, which she'd left at 17 and never gone back to. His mother, who had died the year after Clarence, and who had kept the mill's social relationships running in a way that neither man in the family had understood until it was gone. Small things. The kind of conversation that doesn't have a purpose, except to know someone better. And that matters for exactly that reason. On the 5th evening, they walked along the river at the edge of town, and it was cold, and neither of them had dressed quite warmly enough, and Wade said, without preamble, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "When I wrote that advertisement," he said, "I was trying to solve a problem. That's honest. I needed help, and I didn't have any other way to find it." He paused. "I didn't expect—" He stopped, not because he was being dramatic, but because he was trying to say it correctly. "I didn't think it would be like this. Working with someone who's actually— I didn't know it could work this well." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the river. "I wrote back to your advertisement," she said, "because the letter was honest about what it was. Most of them weren't." She paused. "I also didn't know it would be like this." "Like what?" She thought about it. "Like it was worth something," she said. "Not just useful. Worth something." They stood there for a while, the river running in the dark, the cold settling around them. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't the kind of scene where people say perfect things that resolve all ambiguity. But it was real in the way that matters more than polished. Two people who had spent 7 months building something together, standing beside each other in the cold, and knowing they'd done right to trust it. They went back to the hotel. The rain started again. Neither of them complained about it. Summer arrived and the mill ran hard through it. The grain sourcing arrangement Annika had described to Sorensen came together in June with a farmer named Burke, 40 miles east, who was willing to segregate and deliver hard winter wheat to a cleanliness specification in exchange for a guaranteed purchase price that was 6% above standard market. It was a real cost. It was also exactly what she'd said it would be, recovered on the back end through the improved select grade yield, which increased by almost 20% with better source grain. The storage expansion was completed in July by a carpenter from Billings named Tull, who came recommended by Sorensen and who worked quickly and without needing to be told things twice, which Cleet appreciated because he'd been tasked with coordinating the build while Wade and Annika managed production. Cleet was 20 years old by then, and no longer the person who had stood in the doorway on the first day with skepticism written openly across his face. He wasn't transformed either. He was still occasionally impatient, still had opinions about things that he voiced before he'd fully thought them through, still sometimes moved too fast in the cleaning stage when he was behind schedule and had to redo work as a result. But he knew the process well enough now that Annika trusted him to run the premium grade independently, which was not a small thing, and he knew she trusted him, which mattered to him more than he'd have admitted. One afternoon in August, he asked her, while they were checking the output logs, whether she'd ever thought about writing down the full system. The process, the grade criteria, the sourcing specifications, all of it. She looked at him. "Written down for what purpose?" "I don't know it," he said. In case someone needed it, or wanted to know how it worked." He paused. "Or in case you weren't here." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm not planning to leave." "I know. I'm just saying." She was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about it," she said. "There's a version of this that could work for other operations. Small mills that are losing to the large ones. The system isn't complicated. It just requires doing things carefully and being honest about the numbers. So write it down." "It's not that simple." "Seems like it might be," he said. She said nothing, but she didn't dismiss it the way she'd have dismissed it 6 months earlier. He counted that as something and let it go. She did start writing it down eventually. Not that fall, but the following winter in a new notebook she kept separate from the production ledgers. Wade found it on the desk one January morning and read 20 pages of it before she came in and saw him reading it. She didn't say anything for a moment. "This is good," he said. "This should exist. It's not finished." "I know, finish it." She took the notebook from him and sat down at the desk. He went to start the morning grinding. He heard her pen moving before he was through the door. Bautet. The mill's second winter was different from its first in every way that mattered. The debts were gone. The Halverson contract was in its second year, performing at the contracted volume, with a renegotiation coming in January that Annika was already preparing for. She'd been tracking regional market rates for 6 months, building a case for a rate increase that she believed the numbers justified. Wade did not doubt her. He had stopped doubting her on things that had numbers attached to them, which covered most things. The Sorensen arrangement had expanded. 2 additional bakeries in the Billings area had come on through Sorensen's recommendation, and a settlement store in a town called Farrell's Creek had found them through the Territorial Agricultural Gazette notice after the exhibition and written to ask about supply. Anika had written back the same day. Emmett Chow had stopped making the kind of comments he'd made in the first weeks. He'd never said anything directly. Emmett didn't operate that way. But the comments had stopped, and when a buyer from Miles City came through Ash Hollow asking about local suppliers, Emmett had directed him to the mill without being asked. Wade heard about it from Marta and chose not to mention it to Emmett, who would have found the gratitude uncomfortable. Dora Chow had continued visiting, which had become genuinely social in a way that the early visits hadn't been. She and Anika did not have the kind of friendship that looked like friendship from the outside. There was no warmth performance, no ritual of affection. They talked practically and honestly and occasionally argued about things, and both of them seemed to find it satisfying. Betty Harlan, who had been among the skeptics in October, bought premium flour and had for months. She had told a woman from a settlement east of the ridge that the Mercer Mill was where you went if you wanted flour that behaved. It was the kind of reputation that spread slowly and held, because it was earned rather than announced. In November, a year and a month after Anika had stepped off the stage in Ash Hollow and looked at the mill building at the end of the road, Wade went through the full year's ledger with her at the kitchen table. The number at the bottom of the annual accounting was not large by any standard, except the standard of a man who had been $11.40 from genuine collapse 12 months earlier. It was real. It was theirs. It represented work done carefully by people who had decided to take something seriously. He sat with it for a moment without speaking. "Next year will be better," Anika said. She was looking at the ledger with the expression she used when she was already thinking about adjustments. "I know," he said. Give me a minute with this one." She looked at him. Then she set down her pen and gave him the minute. What he was thinking, sitting there in the kitchen with the fire going properly and the creak audible through the wall and the wheel outside turning in the November dark, was something he couldn't have said in a neat sentence. It was something about what he'd expected from his life when he inherited the mill from his father and what had actually happened, and the distance between those two things. He'd expected to run the thing the way his father had run it, hold the line, keep the wheel turning. He'd expected gradual diminishment in the way that things diminish when they're not growing, and he'd made a kind of peace with that. And then October had happened, and the peace had turned out to be premature. He thought about Prentice in his expensive coat, sitting in that chair with practiced patience, offering $4,200 to stop. He thought about what stopping would have felt like, the relief of it, which would have been real, and the loss of it, which he hadn't fully understood until he'd seen what not stopping produced. There was a version of himself that had taken the money. That version of himself was somewhere more comfortable and somewhere less alive. He thought about the woman across the table, who had come off a stage in October with a leather satchel and a methodical gaze and had looked at a failing mill and seen not a failed enterprise, but a specific list of specific problems with specific solutions, and had worked through that list without drama or complaint or any apparent need to be thanked for it, who had stood beside him against a Chicago consortium, not because she was certain they would win, but because the numbers said the odds were better on this side than the other, who had put her hand in the cold creek water to check a shaft alignment because that was the thing that needed doing. What he understood about her now that he hadn't understood in October was that she wasn't cold. She was precise. The two things looked similar from the outside and were completely different in the way they felt. Cold was distance. Precision was a form of respect for the work, for the numbers, for the people around her. She gave you exactly what was honest and withheld what wasn't, and that was worth more than warmth that cost nothing. He understood also that she had taken a risk coming here that was at least as large as the one he'd taken in not selling. She had come to a place she'd never seen, to a man she'd never met, with a mill she'd never assessed, and she'd put her whole working life into it on the basis of 6 letters and a set of numbers in a ledger that turned out to be exactly as bad as she'd expected. That required something. He wasn't sure what to call it. Not courage, exactly. More like conviction. The belief that work done honestly in a place that needed it was worth the risk of it going wrong. "Anika," he said. She looked up. "I'm glad you wrote back," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not unreadable. Not anymore. He'd learned to read it over the past year the way you learn a language. Slowly, then all at once, and then you can't remember not knowing it. "So am I," she said. She picked up her pen. He looked at the ledger one more time, then closed it. Odd. What nobody in Ash Hollow would have predicted in October, And what most of them would now say was inevitable, in the way people always reframe the past, was this: the mill had not been saved by money or luck or the intervention of anything outside the two people who had decided it was worth saving. It had been saved by attention, by the willingness to look at what was actually wrong instead of what was comfortable to believe, by a woman who read a ledger and saw not defeat, but a sequence of fixable problems, and by a man who made the harder choice, not to sell when selling was easy, not to dismiss what he didn't understand, to trust judgment he hadn't earned yet. These are not dramatic virtues. They don't make for clean stories with obvious heroes. Attention is slow. Honesty is inconvenient. Trust is a risk every single time, even when you've been given reasons for it. And the reasons don't make the risk smaller, they just make it reasonable. What Ash Hollow had by the time the second winter set in was a mill that worked. Not perfectly. The east wall needed attention. There was a stone that was beginning to show wear that would need replacing in spring, and Cleet had made a scheduling error in October that had cost them half a week's production and about which he'd been harder on himself than anyone else was. Not perfectly, just genuinely, solidly, sustainably. The wheel turned in the current, the way it had turned since 1871, the way it would turn for years past the point this story ends. The creek didn't care what year it was or what debts had been paid or what a man in Chicago had offered to make the wheel stop. The creek ran, the wheel turned, and the mill ground what it was given into something better than what came in. That's what mills do. That's what the right people do too, when they find the right work and decide to stay with it. Outside, the November dark sat on the valley, and the stars were hard and clear above the peaks, the way they got when the temperature dropped past a certain point and the air had nothing left in it but cold and light. Inside, the lamp was on. The ledger was closed. There was work to do tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and neither of them would have had it any other way. The river kept moving. The wheel kept turning. That was enough. That was in fact everything.